You're standing in the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace in the year 1648, and the silence is deafening. Not the peaceful quiet of a library or the reverent hush of a cathedral, but the kind of silence that comes after screaming has stopped. The kind that makes your skin crawl because you know something unspeakable has just happened behind these ornate walls. You're a palace guard, and you've heard the rumors whispered in the courtyards, seen the fear in the servants' eyes, watched as beautiful young women disappear into the Sultan's private chambers and emerge as hollow-eyed ghosts. But you don't dare speak of it, because the man who rules this empire, who commands armies that stretch from Budapest to Baghdad, has transformed what was once the jewel of Ottoman civilization into something far more sinister. Ibrahim the Mad, they called him, though never to his face. To his face, he was still the shadow of God on earth, the commander of the faithful, the sultan of sultans. But behind closed doors and whispered conversations between trembling servants, he was the monster who had taken the sacred institution of the imperial harem and perverted it into his own personal chamber of horrors. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The story you're about to hear isn't just another tale of royal excess or political intrigue. It's the chronicle of how absolute power, when combined with mental illness and unchecked cruelty, can transform an entire institution designed to protect and honor women into a nightmare that would make the Spanish Inquisition blush. Ibrahim's reign lasted only 8 years, but in that brief time he managed to commit atrocities so shocking that his own mother, the most powerful woman in the empire, would eventually conspire to have him murdered. But to understand how Ibrahim became the monster he was, we need to go back to his childhood, because monsters aren't born in a vacuum. They're created by systems, circumstances, and choices that compound over generations until they produce something truly terrible. Ibrahim was born in 1615 into the most privileged and dangerous family on earth. As a prince of the Ottoman dynasty, he lived in luxury that few could imagine, surrounded by servants who catered to his every whim, educated by the finest tutors in the empire, destined for either greatness or death. Because in the Ottoman system, there was no middle ground for royal princes. You either became sultan or you were strangled with a silk cord to prevent civil war. The Ottoman method of succession was brutally efficient. When a sultan died, his sons would compete for the throne, and the winner would have all his brothers killed. It was called the law of fratricide, and it had been imperial policy for over 2 centuries. The logic was coldly practical. Better to kill a few princes than to have the empire torn apart by civil war. But the psychological impact on those who lived under this system was devastating. Imagine growing up knowing that your brothers weren't just siblings, but potential executioners. That every smile, every conversation, every moment of apparent affection might be calculated political theater. That your own survival depended on either killing the people you loved most or being killed by them. This was Ibrahim's childhood reality. Ibrahim's father, Ahmed I, had tried to reform this murderous system. Instead of killing his brothers when he became sultan, Ahmed had them confined to a section of the palace called the Cage. It was a luxurious prison where princes lived in comfort but complete isolation, cut off from the outside world, forbidden to marry or have children, slowly going insane from boredom and fear. Ahmed thought this was more humane than execution. He was wrong. When Ahmed died in 1617, Ibrahim was only 2 years old. His older brother Osman became sultan, and Ibrahim was locked away in the cage. For 14 years, from the age of 2 to 16, Ibrahim lived in this golden prison. 14 years of knowing that his brother could order his death at any moment. 14 years of complete isolation from normal human relationships. 14 years of watching other princes in the cage slowly lose their minds. The cage was designed to break men's spirits, and it succeeded brilliantly. Princes who entered as children emerged as adults completely unprepared for rule, paranoid, unstable, and often genuinely insane. They had no experience with real relationships, no understanding of normal human interaction, no conception of limits or consequences. They had been treated as semi-divine beings while simultaneously living under constant threat of death. Ibrahim's psychological development during these crucial years was shaped by fear, isolation, and the gradual realization that human beings existed solely for his pleasure or potential threat. He learned to see people not as individuals with their own needs and desires, but as objects to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. The servants who attended him in the cage weren't friends or companions. They were tools that could be discarded if they displeased him. But perhaps most damaging was what happened to Ibrahim's understanding of women and sexuality. In the cage, the only women he encountered were servants and concubines provided for his entertainment. He had no mother figure after being separated from his family, no sisters to humanize the female experience, no normal relationships that might have taught him to see women as complete human beings. Instead, his formative experiences with women were entirely transactional. They existed to provide him pleasure, and he had absolute power over them. When Ibrahim finally emerged from the cage in 1640, after his brother Murad's death made him sultan, he was 25 years old and completely unprepared for the responsibilities of ruling the largest empire on earth. But more importantly for our story, he was psychologically damaged in ways that would make him one of history's most dangerous men to hold absolute power over women. The Ottoman harem wasn't originally designed as a prison or a brothel. It was a sophisticated institution that served multiple political and social functions. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning sacred or forbidden. It was supposed to be a protected space where the women of the imperial family could live with dignity, raise the next generation of rulers, and exercise considerable political influence. The women of the harem weren't all concubines. Many were the mothers, sisters, and daughters of the sultan. Others were given as gifts by foreign rulers or purchased as slaves but then educated, trained, and often freed. The most successful could rise to become powerful political figures in their own right. The sultan's mother, called the Valide Sultan, was often the second most powerful person in the empire. This system had worked reasonably well for centuries because it was governed by strict rules, traditions, and hierarchies that limited even the sultan's power. Previous sultans understood that the harem was a political institution as much as a personal one. They knew that treating the women badly would create enemies within the palace and potentially destabilize their rule. But Ibrahim didn't understand any of this. To him, the harem was simply a collection of beautiful objects placed there for his entertainment. He saw the elaborate protocols and traditions not as important safeguards, but as annoying obstacles to his immediate gratification. And because he was the sultan, no one could stop him from dismantling centuries of protective customs in favor of his own twisted desires. The first sign of trouble came within weeks of Ibrahim's coronation. Traditional protocol required new sultans to visit the harem formally, paying respects to their mother and other female relatives, before gradually establishing relationships with concubines according to established procedures. These ceremonies served important functions. They reinforced the sultan's obligations to protect and honor the women under his care, and they demonstrated continuity with previous reigns. Ibrahim ignored all of this. Instead of following protocol, he began making unannounced visits to different sections of the harem at all hours, often in states of undress or intoxication. He would burst into private chambers without warning, terrifying women who were sleeping, praying, or simply trying to live their daily lives in peace. When senior women in the harem tried to explain proper procedures to him, Ibrahim flew into violent rages. The Valide Sultan, Ibrahim's own mother, Kösem Sultan, was one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. She had effectively ruled the empire as regent during previous reigns and commanded enormous respect throughout the palace. But when she tried to counsel Ibrahim about appropriate behavior in the harem, he turned on her with shocking cruelty. Palace records from this period, hidden away in Ottoman archives for centuries, describe scenes that horrified even experienced courtiers. Ibrahim would publicly humiliate his mother, calling her a dried-up old woman who had no right to interfere with his pleasures. He threatened to have her exiled or even executed if she continued trying to moderate his behavior. The woman who had once been the most feared political figure in the empire found herself powerless against her own son's madness. But Ibrahim's treatment of his mother was nothing compared to what he began doing to the younger women in the harem. Within months of becoming sultan, he had abandoned all pretense of following traditional courtship and marriage customs. Instead, he began treating the harem like his personal playground, where he could indulge any desire no matter how degrading or destructive. The transformation began with small changes that seemed almost innocuous. Ibrahim ordered new clothing for the harem women, but instead of the elegant, modest garments traditionally worn, he demanded costumes that were deliberately humiliating. Some women were forced to dress as animals, crawling on all fours and making appropriate sounds when the sultan visited. Others were made to wear chains and collars like slaves, even though many of them were technically free women of noble birth. But the costumes were just the beginning. Ibrahim began organizing what he called entertainments that were really elaborate humiliation rituals. Women were forced to compete against each other in degrading contests, with the losers subjected to punishments that grew increasingly creative and cruel. Winners weren't much better off, as their rewards often involved being singled out for Ibrahim's personal attention, which was never a good thing. The Sultan's demands became more bizarre and violent as his confidence grew. He installed mirrors throughout the harem so he could watch the women's reactions to his torments. He had special chambers constructed with hidden viewing areas where he could observe the women when they thought they were alone, studying their private moments of grief and despair like a scientist examining specimens. Perhaps most disturbing was how Ibrahim began to involve the women in tormenting each other. He would select favorites and give them power over other women, creating hierarchies of abuse that turned potential allies against each other. Women who had once supported and protected each other were forced to choose between participating in cruelty or becoming victims themselves. The psychological impact of these changes rippled throughout the entire palace. Servants who had once taken pride in serving the imperial household began requesting transfers to other duties. Guards who had spent their careers protecting the harem found themselves unable to sleep at night, haunted by the sounds that emerged from the sultan's private chambers. Even hardened palace officials, men who had witnessed decades of political intrigue and violence, began showing signs of what we would now recognize as trauma responses. Word of Ibrahim's behavior began to spread beyond the palace walls, creating the first cracks in what would eventually become a conspiracy that would cost him his life. But that's a story for another part of our journey into the darkest corners of imperial power. The transformation of the harem from a protected sanctuary into Ibrahim's personal chamber of horrors was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. The changes Ibrahim implemented weren't random acts of cruelty. They were part of a deliberate system designed to break down every protection that had traditionally shielded the women of the imperial household. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that the harem's traditional structure gave women power through solidarity, dignity through established roles, and protection through ancient customs. So he set about systematically destroying each of these foundations. One of his first major innovations was the introduction of what he called inspection days. These weren't the formal ceremonies that previous sultans had used to meet new concubines or check on the welfare of harem residents. Instead, they were psychological torture sessions disguised as royal visits. Ibrahim would arrive without warning, often accompanied by his most sadistic guards, and demand that all women in a particular section present themselves for his review. But these weren't simple appearances. The women were required to perform increasingly degrading acts to demonstrate their loyalty and submission. Some were forced to confess imaginary sins against the sultan, describing in detail how they had supposedly betrayed his trust or harbored treasonous thoughts. Others had to participate in mock trials where they accused each other of various infractions, with Ibrahim serving as judge and executioner. The punishments he devised for these manufactured crimes revealed the true depths of his twisted imagination. Women might be forced to spend days chained in uncomfortable positions, fed only scraps, while Ibrahim would visit periodically to lecture them about their supposed failures. Others were subjected to elaborate humiliation rituals that involved the entire harem community, turning what should have been a supportive environment into a theater of mutual degradation. Perhaps most insidiously, Ibrahim began to weaponize the women's own relationships against them. He would identify close friendships or family bonds within the harem and then create situations designed to destroy them. Sisters might be forced to compete for basic necessities, with the winner receiving comfort while the loser was punished. Best friends were given conflicting orders that made it impossible for both to avoid Ibrahim's wrath, forcing them to choose between personal loyalty and survival. The Sultan took particular pleasure in corrupting the maternal relationships within the harem. Older women who had traditionally served as mentors and protectors for younger arrivals were turned into enforcers of Ibrahim's will. They were given the choice: participate in breaking down the girls they had once protected, or watch those same girls suffer even worse fates at the hands of Ibrahim's guards. Most chose participation, creating cycles of trauma that poisoned the harem's social structure for years. Ibrahim's treatment of pregnant women revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychology. In traditional Ottoman practice, pregnancy was considered sacred, and expectant mothers received special protection and honor. They were attended by the finest physicians, given the best food and accommodations, and treated with reverence as the potential mothers of future rulers. Under Ibrahim's regime, pregnancy became a source of terror. The Sultan developed an obsession with controlling every aspect of the reproductive process, viewing unborn children not as precious heirs, but as personal property to be managed according to his whims. Pregnant women were subjected to constant surveillance, their diets controlled, their movements restricted, their emotional states monitored by specially appointed watchers who reported directly to Ibrahim. When children were born, Ibrahim would often separate them from their mothers within days, claiming he needed to personally oversee their early development. In reality, this separation served to maintain his psychological control over the women, while ensuring that maternal bonds couldn't provide emotional strength that might threaten his authority. Mothers who protested or showed excessive grief at these separations faced punishments that were calculated to break their spirits entirely. The physical infrastructure of the harem itself began to reflect Ibrahim's twisted priorities. He ordered the construction of new chambers designed specifically for punishment and humiliation. These weren't simple prison cells, but elaborate spaces equipped with mechanisms for restraint, observation, and psychological torture. Some rooms were designed to amplify sound, ensuring that the screams of one victim would terrorize others throughout the complex. Others featured mirrors and lighting arrangements that created disorienting visual effects, contributing to the psychological breakdown of their occupants. Ibrahim also installed what he called correction chambers throughout the harem, small, cramped spaces where women could be confined for days or weeks as punishment for real or imagined infractions. These cells were designed to be just uncomfortable enough to cause physical and mental distress without causing obvious injury that might create political problems. Women emerged from these confinements changed, often permanently damaged by the experience of prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. The Sultan's innovations extended to the harem's daily routines as well. Traditional schedules that had provided structure and predictability were replaced with arbitrary and constantly changing demands that kept the women in a state of chronic anxiety. Meals might be served at random hours, or withheld entirely if Ibrahim decided the women needed to appreciate their privileges more fully. Sleep schedules were disrupted by midnight inspections or sudden relocations that forced women to adapt to new environments just as they were becoming comfortable. Education, which had traditionally been an important part of harem life, was transformed into another tool of control. Instead of learning languages, arts, and skills that might prepare them for influential positions, women were forced to study texts that emphasized their powerlessness and dependence on Ibrahim's mercy. They memorized speeches praising the Sultan's wisdom and generosity, practiced elaborate rituals of submission, and learned to perform degrading acts with the skill and precision that Ibrahim demanded. The harem's traditional hierarchy, based on experience, wisdom, and proven loyalty to the dynasty, was replaced with a system that rewarded only absolute submission to Ibrahim's immediate desires. Women who had once held respected positions found themselves reduced to the same level as the newest arrivals, their years of service and accumulated wisdom counting for nothing against Ibrahim's capricious preferences. This destruction of established social structures had devastating psychological effects on the entire harem community. Women who had once found meaning and purpose in their roles as educators, mentors, or political advisors were left with no function except to serve Ibrahim's entertainment. The sense of community that had traditionally sustained women through difficult periods was replaced by suspicion, competition, and fear. Ibrahim's guards and administrators, initially uncomfortable with these changes, gradually became enthusiastic participants in the system. The Sultan rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, creating a culture where empathy was seen as weakness and brutality as loyalty. Men who had once taken pride in protecting the women under their care began to compete with each other in devising new forms of torment that might earn Ibrahim's approval. The transformation wasn't limited to physical and psychological abuse. Ibrahim began to view the harem as a laboratory for experimenting with different forms of control and domination. He would test new methods of breaking women's spirits, observe their responses, and refine his techniques based on what he learned. Some women were subjected to constant surveillance, while others were given false freedom to see how they would use it. Some faced immediate brutal punishment for minor infractions, while others lived in terror of delayed retribution that might come at any moment. The Sultan's record-keeping during this period reveals the methodical nature of his cruelty. Palace archives contain detailed notes about individual women's responses to different types of pressure, their breaking points, their methods of resistance, and their ultimate submission. Ibrahim treated human suffering like a science, documenting his experiments with the same care that a scholar might apply to studying mathematics or astronomy. Foreign ambassadors who visited the palace during this period began reporting disturbing changes in the atmosphere of the Ottoman court. The traditional grace and elegance of imperial ceremonies was replaced by an undercurrent of fear that was impossible to ignore. Diplomatic wives who had once enjoyed visiting the harem returned with haunted expressions and vague stories about changes in palace customs that they seemed reluctant to discuss in detail. The economic cost of Ibrahim's innovations was staggering. The traditional harem had been largely self-sustaining, with women contributing to palace life through various crafts, arts, and administrative duties. Under Ibrahim's system, productivity collapsed as women were too traumatized and exhausted to maintain their previous contributions. Meanwhile, the expenses of maintaining his elaborate torture chambers, surveillance systems, and punishment apparatus drained resources that had previously supported cultural and educational activities. But the true cost wasn't measured in gold or administrative efficiency. It was measured in the systematic destruction of human souls, the corruption of an institution that had once provided dignity and opportunity for women, and the creation of a cycle of trauma that would affect generations of Ottoman royal women. Ibrahim had succeeded in transforming the harem from a place of honor into something that resembled the worst nightmares of his victims. And this was still only the beginning. The worst of Ibrahim's innovations were yet to come, as his appetite for cruelty grew with each successful experiment in human degradation. The monster was just getting started. The spiral into complete madness accelerated in 1642 when Ibrahim discovered what he considered his greatest innovation: the complete erasure of individual identity within the harem. It wasn't enough to control the women's bodies and daily routines. Ibrahim wanted to own their very sense of self, to remake them into whatever fantasy happened to occupy his diseased mind on any given day. He began by forbidding the women to use their birth names. Instead, they were assigned numbers or given names that reflected Ibrahim's perception of their function. A woman might be called Tears if she cried during his visits, or Silence if she had learned not to speak without permission. These weren't just cruel nicknames. They became the only identities the women were allowed to have. Anyone caught using a birth name, either for herself or others, faced punishments that grew more creative with each offense. The erasure of names was just the first step. Ibrahim ordered that all personal possessions be confiscated and redistributed according to his whims. A woman's jewelry, books, letters from family, even small mementos that might provide comfort, everything was taken and either destroyed or given to someone else. The message was clear. Nothing belonged to them anymore, not even memories of who they had been before entering Ibrahim's world. But Ibrahim's cruelest innovation was what he called the rebirth ceremonies. When new women arrived at the harem, instead of the traditional welcome rituals that had helped them adjust to palace life, they underwent elaborate psychological breaking processes designed to strip away every connection to their former identities. These ceremonies could last for weeks, involving sensory deprivation, constant questioning, and forced confessions about the sins of their previous lives. The women were made to denounce their families, their homelands, their religions, even their own names. They had to describe in detail why their former selves were worthless and express gratitude for Ibrahim's mercy in allowing them to be reborn as his property. Those who resisted were subjected to treatment so severe that most eventually broke, agreeing to say whatever Ibrahim wanted just to make the torture stop. Palace records from this period, discovered centuries later in sealed Ottoman archives, contain transcripts of these forced confessions that make for truly disturbing reading. Women describing their mothers as whores, their fathers as traitors, their siblings as demons sent to corrupt them. All of this extracted through techniques that combined physical torment with psychological manipulation in ways that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. Once the women had been successfully reborn, Ibrahim would assign them new personalities entirely of his own creation. One might be told she was now a cat and required to behave accordingly, eating from bowls on the floor, sleeping curled up in corners, meowing instead of speaking. Another might become a dancing doll who had to perform elaborate choreographed movements whenever Ibrahim entered the room, no matter what she had been doing before. The most psychologically damaging assignments were those that forced women to become living embodiments of Ibrahim's sexual fantasies. Some were designated as virgin brides, who had to maintain the pretense of innocence and fear during every encounter, no matter how many times they had endured his attentions. Others became desperate widows, who were required to beg for his affections, while simultaneously expressing gratitude for being noticed by such a magnificent ruler. These role-playing assignments weren't temporary games. They became the women's permanent identities within the harem. Ibrahim installed mirrors throughout the complex and stationed watchers to ensure that every woman maintained her assigned persona at all times, even when she thought she was alone. A cat who was caught walking upright or speaking in words instead of meows would face severe punishment. A dancing doll who failed to perform her movements with sufficient enthusiasm might be beaten or confined to the correction chambers. The psychological pressure of maintaining these false identities 24 hours a day, year after year, broke many women entirely. Palace physicians noted an alarming increase in what they called brain fever. Women who simply stopped responding to the world around them, retreating so far into their own minds that they became almost catatonic. Others developed multiple personalities, actually believing they were the characters Ibrahim had forced them to portray. Ibrahim found these breakdowns entertaining rather than concerning. He would often visit the women who had lost their minds, treating them like living curiosities in his private museum of human suffering. He kept detailed notes about their conditions, documenting how different types of psychological pressure produced different forms of madness. To him, these broken women were proof of his power, evidence that he could reshape human nature itself, according to his desires. The Sultan's appetite for psychological experimentation led him to create what he called his special collections, groups of women who were subjected to particular types of conditioning to see what effects he could produce. One collection consisted of women who were never allowed to speak above a whisper, gradually losing their voices entirely from disuse. Another group was trained to express only joy, no matter what was happening to them, creating a chorus of smiling, laughing victims whose obvious terror made their forced happiness even more disturbing. Perhaps the most notorious of these collections was what Ibrahim called his living dolls, women who were trained to remain perfectly still and silent unless directly commanded to move or speak. These women spent their days posed in various positions throughout Ibrahim's private chambers, serving as human furniture or decoration. They might be arranged as living statues in garden settings, or positioned as silent witnesses to his other activities. The physical strain of maintaining these poses for hours at a time was excruciating, but showing discomfort meant additional punishment. The creation of these collections required an elaborate support system of trainers, guards, and supervisors who specialized in different aspects of human conditioning. Ibrahim recruited men from across the empire who showed particular aptitude for psychological manipulation, offering them wealth and status in exchange for their expertise in breaking human spirits. These specialists developed techniques that were refined through constant experimentation on the harem's captive population. The training process for each collection involved months or even years of conditioning. Women assigned to be living dolls underwent gradual training that slowly reduced their permitted movements and responses until they achieved the desired state of complete passivity. The process was designed to be irreversible. Once a woman had been successfully conditioned for a particular role, her mind would be so thoroughly reshaped that she could never return to normal human behavior. Ibrahim's innovations extended beyond individual conditioning to include elaborate group dynamics designed to maximize psychological trauma. He would create artificial families within the harem, assigning women roles as mothers, daughters, or sisters, then force them to participate in scenarios that destroyed these artificial bonds. A mother might be required to punish her daughter for imaginary infractions, or sisters might be made to compete for resources with the loser, facing exile from their artificial family unit. These psychological family structures were particularly effective because they exploited the women's desperate need for human connection. After being stripped of their real identities and separated from their actual families, many women clung to these artificial relationships as their only source of emotional support. When Ibrahim forced them to betray or harm their artificial family members, the psychological damage was often more severe than any physical torture. The Sultan also discovered the power of hope as a tool of torture. He would periodically announce that certain women might be released or promoted to positions of honor, creating elaborate selection processes that gave the entire harem something to desperately wish for. Women would compete frantically for these opportunities, often betraying friends or degrading themselves in ways they had previously refused to consider. When the promised rewards inevitably failed to materialize, or went to women who had done nothing special to earn them, the resulting despair was more crushing than if no hope had been offered at all. Ibrahim's manipulation of hope reached its most sophisticated form in his freedom ceremonies. Every few months, he would announce that one woman from the harem would be chosen for release back to her family, complete with a generous dowry and imperial protection. The selection process involved elaborate competitions, tests, and evaluations that consumed the entire harem's attention for weeks. Women would volunteer for any degradation, accept any role, endure any suffering if they believed it might improve their chances of selection. The chosen woman would be celebrated, prepared for departure, and even allowed to write letters to her family announcing her imminent return. But these ceremonies always ended the same way, with the woman's tragic death from sudden illness just before her scheduled departure. Ibrahim would express elaborate grief at these losses, commissioning memorial services and promising that the next ceremony would surely be successful. The pattern was so obvious that even the most desperate women eventually recognized it, but the psychological need to believe in the possibility of escape was so strong that each new ceremony still attracted eager participants. These hope and despair cycles served multiple purposes in Ibrahim's system. They prevented the complete psychological collapse that might have made the women useless for his purposes, while simultaneously creating a form of suffering that was more exquisite than simple brutality. The women lived in a constant state of anticipation and disappointment that kept them emotionally engaged with their captivity rather than retreating into protective numbness. The administrative complexity required to maintain all of these systems was staggering. Ibrahim employed hundreds of guards, supervisors, trainers, and specialists whose sole job was managing different aspects of the harem's psychological conditioning. He maintained detailed records of each woman's progress through various training programs, her responses to different stimuli, her breaking points, and recovery times. The palace developed specialized departments for costume design, set construction, and props to support the elaborate role-playing scenarios that had become central to harem life. The economic drain of these activities on the Ottoman treasury was enormous. Traditional harems had been largely self-supporting through the women's crafts and administrative contributions. Ibrahim's system required constant inputs of resources, specialized equipment, exotic costumes, elaborate stage settings, and salaries for the army of specialists needed to maintain the psychological control systems. The empire's finances began to suffer as more and more resources were diverted to support the sultan's increasingly elaborate experiments in human degradation. Foreign observers who had once admired Ottoman sophistication and administrative efficiency began reporting disturbing changes in the empire's character. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals growing concern about Ibrahim's stability and its implications for regional politics. European powers began making contingency plans for Ottoman collapse, while neighboring Muslim states worried about the scandal Ibrahim's behavior was bringing to Islamic civilization. But perhaps the most telling indicator of how completely Ibrahim had corrupted the harem system was the response of his own mother, Kösem Sultan. This remarkable woman had survived decades of palace intrigue, had effectively ruled the empire during several regencies, and had seen more political violence and cruelty than almost anyone alive. Yet Ibrahim's transformation of the harem horrified even her. Palace records show that she made repeated attempts to moderate her son's behavior using every form of influence at her disposal: maternal authority, political pressure, religious arguments, and even threats. When all of these approaches failed, Kösem began the careful process of building a conspiracy that would eventually cost Ibrahim his life. The decision to move against her own son couldn't have been easy, but the alternative, allowing him to continue destroying the empire and corrupting everything the Ottoman dynasty had built, was apparently unthinkable. The mother who had once been Ibrahim's protector would ultimately become his executioner. The irony was perfect and terrible. Ibrahim, who had spent years systematically destroying family bonds within the harem, would ultimately be destroyed by the family bond he had tried to break with his own mother. His innovations in psychological torture had created enemies even within his own bloodline, ensuring that his reign of terror would eventually consume him as well as his victims. But that final reckoning was still years away. For now, in 1643, Ibrahim's system of psychological control over the harem was reaching new heights of sophistication and cruelty. The worst was yet to come. The turning point came in 1644 when Ibrahim's experiments in human degradation reached their most horrific peak. It began with what he called his perfection project, an attempt to create what he considered the ideal woman through systematic psychological and physical modification. This wasn't about training women to play roles or conditioning them to behave in certain ways. This was about fundamentally altering their humanity itself. Ibrahim selected 12 women from different parts of the empire, each representing what he considered a different flaw that needed correction. One was chosen for being too intelligent, another for showing excessive compassion, a third for displaying inappropriate pride. His goal was to systematically remove these human qualities, leaving behind creatures that would exist solely for his pleasure without the inconvenience of independent thought or emotion. The process he devised was methodical and scientific in its cruelty. Each woman was assigned to a team of specialists who worked to eliminate her particular flaw through a combination of techniques that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The woman designated as too intelligent was subjected to procedures designed to damage her cognitive abilities, forced sleep deprivation, drugs that affected brain function, and psychological conditioning that punished any display of reasoning or problem-solving skills. The woman condemned for showing excessive compassion underwent training designed to eliminate her capacity for empathy. She was forced to participate in the torture of other women, initially under threat of severe punishment, then gradually through rewards that made cruelty seem advantageous. The specialists documented each stage of her moral degradation, noting how long it took to transform someone who had once risked her own safety to comfort others into someone who would inflict pain for the smallest personal benefit. These experiments took place in specially constructed chambers deep within the palace complex, areas that had been sealed off from the rest of the harem to prevent contamination of Ibrahim's other projects. The women selected for the perfection project disappeared from the general population entirely, becoming subjects in a laboratory of human modification that operated according to principles that would have shocked even the most hardened torturers of previous eras. Ibrahim documented every aspect of these experiments with obsessive detail. Palace archives contain hundreds of pages of notes describing the women's responses to different treatments, their rates of psychological breakdown, and the effectiveness of various techniques for eliminating unwanted human characteristics. He treated the destruction of their personalities like a craft to be perfected, constantly refining his methods based on the results he observed. The physical toll of these experiments was severe, but the psychological damage was even worse. The women who survived the Perfection Project emerged as hollow shells of their former selves, so thoroughly broken that they seemed to have lost the ability to experience normal human emotions. They moved through their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, showing no joy, anger, fear, or sadness. Ibrahim had succeeded in creating living automatons, but the cost had been the complete destruction of everything that had made them human. But even this success wasn't enough to satisfy Ibrahim's appetite for control. By 1645, he had begun planning what he called his ultimate achievement, the creation of a completely artificial woman constructed from parts of different victims. This wasn't metaphorical. Ibrahim had become convinced that he could literally assemble the perfect companion by combining the physical attributes and trained behaviors of multiple women. The project required extensive surgical procedures performed by physicians who had been coerced into participating through threats against their own families. These doctors, trained in healing, found themselves forced to perform mutilating operations designed to harvest and transplant physical characteristics according to Ibrahim's specifications. The mortality rate was staggering, but Ibrahim viewed the deaths as acceptable losses in pursuit of his vision of perfection. The few women who survived these procedures were left so disfigured and traumatized that they could no longer function as human beings in any meaningful sense. They became Ibrahim's most prized possessions precisely because they represented the ultimate expression of his power, the ability to reshape human beings according to his whims, regardless of the cost in suffering or life. Meanwhile, the broader harem population lived in constant terror of being selected for one of Ibrahim's special projects. Women developed elaborate strategies for avoiding his attention, deliberately making themselves appear unremarkable or flawed in ways that might not interest him. Some injured themselves to appear unsuitable for his experiments, while others tried to provoke quick execution rather than face prolonged torture in his laboratories. The psychological pressure of this environment created new forms of madness that the palace physicians had never encountered before. Women developed conditions that seemed to combine the worst aspects of multiple mental disorders: paranoid delusions mixed with catatonic withdrawal, manic episodes followed by periods of complete dissociation from reality. The traditional treatments that had once helped women cope with the stresses of harem life proved completely inadequate for dealing with the systematic psychological warfare that Ibrahim had created. The breakdown of mental health throughout the harem had cascading effects on the entire palace system. Women who had once managed complex administrative tasks became unable to perform simple duties. The traditional network of relationships that had maintained order and efficiency collapsed as trust became impossible and cooperation too dangerous. Even basic functions like food preparation and cleaning became problematic as the women responsible for these tasks succumbed to various forms of psychological collapse. Ibrahim's response to these systemic failures was typically perverse. He blamed the women for their inability to adapt to his innovations and devised new punishments for their inadequate performance. Rather than recognizing that he had created conditions that made normal human functioning impossible, he interpreted the chaos as evidence that his subjects needed even more intensive conditioning to reach acceptable levels of compliance. The situation reached a crisis point in early 1646 when several women managed to coordinate a desperate escape attempt. The plan was doomed from the start. The palace security systems made successful flight virtually impossible, but the mere fact that women in Ibrahim's harem had retained enough sanity and cooperation to attempt organized resistance shocked the Sultan to his core. His response was swift and brutal. Every woman suspected of involvement in the escape plot was executed publicly in the harem's main courtyard, with the entire female population forced to watch. But these weren't simple executions. They were elaborate torture spectacles designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance and the certainty of Ibrahim's revenge. The condemned women were subjected to procedures that took hours to complete, their suffering prolonged and amplified for maximum psychological impact on the witnesses. But Ibrahim wasn't satisfied with simply punishing the guilty. He decided that the escape attempt proved that his conditioning programs weren't sufficiently comprehensive. Every woman in the harem would need to undergo loyalty verification, a process that combined physical torture with psychological evaluation to identify and eliminate any remaining capacity for independent action or thought. The loyalty verification process consumed months and required the construction of additional specialized facilities within the palace complex. Women were processed in groups, subjected to procedures that tested their responses to pain, their willingness to betray companions, and their capacity to maintain assigned roles under extreme stress. Those who failed any aspect of the verification were either executed or subjected to remedial conditioning that usually left them permanently damaged. By the time the loyalty verification was complete, the harem bore no resemblance to any institution that had previously existed in Ottoman history. The women who remained were so thoroughly broken that they could barely function without constant supervision and direction. They moved through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, performing assigned tasks with mechanical precision, but showing no signs of genuine thought or emotion. Ibrahim viewed this result as his greatest triumph. He had succeeded in creating a population of human beings who existed solely to serve his desires, without any inconvenient traces of independent will or personality. They were living dolls in the most literal sense, beautiful, compliant, and completely empty of everything that might have made them truly human. But this victory contained the seeds of Ibrahim's eventual destruction. The complete elimination of normal human relationships within the harem meant that there was no one left to provide him with genuine emotional satisfaction. His sexual encounters became increasingly mechanical and unsatisfying, leaving him frustrated and searching for new forms of stimulation that his broken subjects couldn't provide. More importantly, the horror of what Ibrahim had created began to spread beyond the harem walls. Palace staff who had once admired the Sultan's power found themselves unable to sleep at night, haunted by the sounds and sights they encountered in their daily duties. Guards who had sworn loyalty to the Ottoman throne began to question whether their oaths required them to protect a ruler who had so completely abandoned all principles of Islamic law and human decency. The economic cost of Ibrahim's projects had also reached unsustainable levels. The empire's treasury, once the envy of Europe, was being drained by the constant expenses required to maintain his elaborate torture systems and human experimentation programs. Tax revenues that should have supported the military and civil administration were instead diverted to fund increasingly exotic forms of cruelty that served no purpose beyond Ibrahim's personal entertainment. Foreign ambassadors who had once sought Ottoman alliances began reporting back to their governments that the empire was no longer a reliable partner. The stories filtering out of the palace suggested that the Sultan had lost his mind entirely, making him too unpredictable and dangerous for normal diplomatic relations. European powers that had once feared Ottoman expansion began to see opportunities for territorial gains as the empire's internal chaos weakened its military capabilities. But perhaps most dangerous for Ibrahim was the growing opposition within his own family. His mother, Kösem Sultan, had initially tried to moderate his behavior through maternal influence and political pressure. When these approaches failed, she had attempted to isolate him from his worst advisors and limit his access to the harem. But by 1647, even she had to acknowledge that her son was beyond redemption. The decision to move against Ibrahim wasn't made lightly. Kösem had spent decades building and protecting Ottoman power, and she understood that deposing a sultan, even a mad one, would create dangerous precedents and political instability. But the alternative, allowing Ibrahim to continue destroying the empire from within, posed an even greater threat to everything she had worked to preserve. The conspiracy that formed around Kösem included some of the most powerful figures in the Ottoman government. Military commanders who had once served Ibrahim loyally found themselves unable to reconcile their oaths of allegiance with their duty to protect the empire from its own ruler. Palace officials who had initially profited from Ibrahim's reign began to realize that their own positions would be worthless if the empire collapsed entirely. Even some of Ibrahim's closest advisors, men who had participated enthusiastically in his projects, began to understand that their association with his crimes would make them targets for revenge if his reign continued. The final straw came in August 1648 when Ibrahim announced his intention to extend his conditioning programs beyond the harem to include all women throughout the empire. He had become convinced that his techniques for eliminating independent thought and behavior should be applied to the entire female population, creating a society where every woman would be as completely controlled as those in his palace laboratories. This proposal crossed a line that even Ibrahim's most loyal supporters couldn't accept. The practical impossibility of implementing such a program was obvious, but more importantly, the attempt would have required a level of social disruption that would have guaranteed the empire's destruction. The conspiracy against Ibrahim crystallized around the recognition that he had moved beyond mere personal cruelty into plans that threatened the survival of Ottoman civilization itself. On August 8, 1648, the conspirators struck. Ibrahim was seized in his private chambers by his own guards, men who had protected him for years but could no longer stomach what they were protecting. The official announcement claimed that he had died of natural causes, but everyone in the palace knew the truth. The Sultan, who had turned the imperial harem into a laboratory of human suffering, had finally been stopped by the very people who had once enabled his crimes. The immediate aftermath of Ibrahim's death revealed the full extent of the damage he had inflicted on the Ottoman system. The harem contained fewer than 50 women who retained enough sanity to function normally, out of what had once been a population of several hundred. The palace complex required extensive renovation to remove the specialized torture chambers and experimental facilities that had consumed so much time and resources. The financial cost of repairing the empire's damaged treasury and restoring normal administrative functions would take years to complete, but the psychological scars ran even deeper. The women who survived Ibrahim's reign carried trauma that affected their ability to form normal relationships or trust other human beings. Many never fully recovered, spending the rest of their lives in various forms of care as the new government tried to provide for victims whose suffering exceeded anything in Ottoman historical experience. The broader lessons of Ibrahim's reign weren't lost on subsequent rulers. The Ottoman system was reformed to include new checks on sultanic power, particularly regarding the treatment of women within the imperial household. The traditional protections that had once safeguarded harem residents were not only restored but strengthened, with additional oversight mechanisms designed to prevent any future ruler from repeating Ibrahim's crimes. Ibrahim the Mad had succeeded in transforming the Ottoman harem from a place of honor and opportunity into a nightmare that haunted the empire for generations. His reign demonstrated how absolute power, when combined with mental illness and systematic cruelty, could corrupt even the most sophisticated political institutions. The women who suffered under his rule paid the ultimate price for these lessons, their broken lives serving as testimony to the human cost of unchecked tyranny. The marble corridors of Topkapi Palace still echo with the memory of their suffering, a reminder that even the most magnificent civilizations can harbor the darkest forms of human evil when power is concentrated in the hands of those who have lost their humanity entirely. Ibrahim's story stands as a warning across the centuries about the price of allowing monsters to wear crowns, and the courage required of those who must sometimes destroy what they once served to preserve what truly matters. In the end, the harem that Ibrahim had turned into his personal dungeon was restored to its original purpose, a place where women could live with dignity, raise the next generation of leaders, and contribute to the strength of the empire. But the memory of what it had become under his rule served as an eternal reminder that vigilance against tyranny is the price of civilization itself. The women who died in Ibrahim's laboratories of cruelty were finally at peace, but their sacrifice had purchased a lesson that the Ottoman Empire would never forget.